A surprise. The Jets are keeping Allen Lazard in 2025. A shock. I actually don't think it's a terrible move. Let's dive into it today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Friday, April 11th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay tuned for the Armada Player of the Week later in the show. Well, the Jets made some news yesterday. Allen Lazard, a player that most of us assumed would be cut, is staying with the team in 2025. Lazard and the Jets have worked out a restructured contract, which sees the wide receiver taking a big pay cut. You know, the Jets kept talking about how they were trying to redo Lazard's deal. I did not quite believe that they'd be able to work out a new deal that made sense for them. There's a lot to dive into when we talk about what this means for the New York Jets. And I have to say, I'm as shocked as anybody because I would have, if you had told me at the start of the offseason that Allen Lazard was staying with the Jets, I probably would have told you I hate the move. And I'm never going to say keeping Allen Lazard is a good move, but I think that this is a justifiable move. And it's a move that I understand. And again, like, if you told me in January Jets are keeping Allen Lazard, and John, you're going to understand why, I'm not sure I would have believed you. But a lot of it comes down to the terms of the new contract. And give Jason Fitzgerald of OverTheCap.com credit. He was the one who broke the story. Lazard is taking a substantial pay cut. So this is not we're moving cap space around. This is not, we're reducing his cap space this year and pushing a lot of money to the future. This is a straight pay cut. And it is a significant pay cut. It actually cuts Lazard's cap number for 2025 by $8.6 million. And that's important because if the Jets had cut Lazard, they'd only gained $6.6 million in cap space. So the Jets actually gained more cap space by doing this move than they would have by straight cutting Lazard. Now, there is a little caveat here. Because of the way the deal was restructured, the Jets do add some dead money for 2026. They add $4.368 million in 2026 for dead money. So the net over the 2 years is the Jets will end up paying maybe like $2.3 million more. But this year they gain $2 million extra money in cap space, and Jets are very tight up against the cap right now, so they could really use that space. At the end of the day, they don't really add that much. In the long run, they're just paying like $2.3 million more. It's not a ton of money. And Lazard's salary is going down quite a bit. Also, and this is a big part of the deal, Lazard was under contract in 2026. It was the fourth and final year of the 4-year contract he signed in 2023. That year's gone now. So this is now the final year of Allen Lazard's contract. And again, like, I'm not going to say it's good because, like, I don't like Lazard. I never liked Lazard. I never liked him when he was signed. If it's up to me, like, I'm just saying, let's move on. Let's start fresh. We'll get him out of here. He's a remnant of the Aaron Rodgers era. But I will say this. He's only got $1.75 million in guaranteed money this year. That's the type of contract where Lazard is palatable to me being on the roster. And this partially shows you that Lazard realized there was zero market for him. There was talk that the Jets were, kind of pursuing a trade with Lazard. And, maybe they let Lazard and his agent speak across the league and kind of gauge what the market was for him if he was cut. And the fact that Lazard took such a hefty pay cut shows that there's really no market for him. And that's not a surprise because you've seen what's happened the last 2 years. Lazard's about to hit 30 years of age. He'll turn 30 on December 11th. So a guy who was never that good to begin with has been awful the last 2 years and is about to turn 30. That's not a good combination if you want to continue your career. So it's very possible that, again, the $1.75 million the Jets are giving him in guaranteed salary is about as good as he could have done on the market. I mean, of course, if Aaron Rodgers signs with the team, that team would have become a suitor for Lazard. But it's not entirely clear that Lazard would be guaranteed a roster spot on any other team. So the Jets played some hardball here, and I can see, and they've made Lazard's salary at a level where there's at least a logic to keeping him. And part of this is that, look, the Jets are very thin at the wide receiver position right now. Now, what does Lazard really add? Well, based on the last 2 years, not a whole lot. I mean, he had a few moments last year with Rodgers, but Lazard's biggest asset to a team is he understands how to break his routes the way Aaron Rodgers wants him to break his routes, because Rodgers wants his receivers to read coverage and adjust their routes accordingly if coverage breaks a certain way. Lazard's big, but he doesn't play big. He's very weak at the point of attack with the catch. He's not good at high pointing the ball. He kind of gets shoved around by physical corners instead of asserting his own will. He may be big, but he doesn't come with any of the attributes big receivers bring to the table. He's not fast. He's certainly not fast. He certainly doesn't have good hands. But I will say this. At points during his tenure in Green Bay, he was an okay role player. I'm not going to say he was a great role player, but he was a guy who, had some 500-yard seasons. I mean, he was over 400 yards in 2019 and 2020. He was over 500 yards in 2021. He was over 700 yards in 2022. His production is very replaceable, but the Jets have a lot of question marks at the wide receiver position right now. It's not entirely clear whether the Jets have anybody who can be a functional role player after Garrett Wilson at the receiver position. We'll talk about that in a bit. And there's obviously no guarantees that Lazard's going to bounce back and refine his Green Bay form, especially with Rodgers not here at quarterback, who was, again, like the only conceivable selling point you could have for me right now about Allen Lazard is if Aaron Rodgers was your quarterback. He's not. But if Lazard can find that form again, he's not a good number 2 receiver. So the Jets still are going to need some help. Jets are still going to need some more help at the wide receiver position. But he's at least a guy who maybe can help you as a complementary part. And at $1.75 million guaranteed, and when you're reducing his cap number by $8.6 million, I think with every player there's a price where he makes sense, because at the end of the day, every player you've got is a gamble in some degree, it's to some extent or another. You don't know for sure how somebody's going to produce in a given year. Now, a guy with a great track record, probably a good bet to produce. A guy with a lousy track record, probably not a good bet to produce. But if you get a guy like Lazard, who at least has some moderate history of production, and you're getting him for as cheap as the Jets are getting him, maybe it's worth it to keep him around. Maybe it's worth it to see if he can recapture that form. It's nothing to be excited about. It's not a move that's likely to move the needle all that much for the New York Jets, but it's a type of move you can understand. I remember when the Jets signed Lazard, one of the things I said was that, when he was a non-drafted rookie playing on a non-drafted rookie contract where, he's making a very small amount of money, you could make a case he was an asset for the Green Bay Packers, because most guys making the amount of money Lazard was making in Green Bay provide you zero value, whereas Lazard at least occasionally would produce a complementary part. At $11 million, is an awful value. He's nowhere close to being a functional player at $11 million. At 1.75 guaranteed, I mean, maybe it'll work. I know some folks think I'm going too easy on Darren Muji and Aaron Glenn at this early stage of their tenure, but looking at it, I think this is justifiable. I'm not saying it's going to work, because I'm not sure it's going to work. In fact, I'm kind of inclined to think Lazard's just not going to be very helpful to the team. But I at least understand why they're making this move, which is more than I ever thought I'd say about Allen Lazard being back on the Jets for 2025. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, let's try and figure out where Lazard fits in the Jets receiver hierarchy. In fact, let's figure out what the Jets have at the wide receiver position and how much work needs to be done. Hint, it's a lot. And we'll go into more detail on that continuing here on this Friday edition of Locked On. The Armada Player of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week we're looking at our draft prospects to pick one guy that stands apart, the guy we believe showcased the strength and power needed to push the Jets forward as we look forward to the next season. This week's Armada and clear-cut player of the week is Tet McMillan out of Arizona. We're talking a lot about wide receivers today. We're going to talk about Tet McMillan in a little bit. A guy who's a tremendous receiver prospect, a guy who could go top 10, but a guy who could be available when the Jets pick and fill a critical need. Again, we'll get to that later. McMillan, he's a heavy-duty prospect. He's rugged. He conquers the field with capability and confidence. Dream big, go big. And when it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer. That's exactly what I think Tet McMillan can do here. It's clear that our player of the week is out here ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of their outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Amazingly, Allen Lazard is staying with the New York Jets in 2025. And perhaps even more amazingly, I'm not spending an episode of Locked On Jets annihilating the Jets for keeping Allen Lazard for 2025. Strange times we live in, but I think the deal they worked out with him, if not a good, again, I'm not going to use the phrase good when we talk about the Jets keeping Allen Lazard, but it's a deal that's at least justifiable. It's a deal you could argue makes sense. I'm not going to be the one that argues that, but I think somebody else could make that case. So Lazard sticks around with the Jets, and I think this leads to a natural question. How does this change the Jets' strategy when we talk about the 2025 NFL draft? And the simple answer is probably not at all. Lazard doesn't really fix the wide receiver group. Now, the good with the Jets is that you've got Garrett Wilson, a perennial 1,000-yard receiver, who's, again, he's been a 1,000-yard machine since he entered the league 3 years ago. 3 seasons, 3,000-yard years. And he's done it, if we're going to be honest, with pretty bad quarterback play. Zach Wilson year 1, Zach Wilson year 2, the shell of Aaron Rodgers in year 3. And of the 3, the shell of Rodgers was probably the best, but still not very good. I mean, I think Rodgers was probably in the if you rank the quarterbacks last year, I think Rodgers would be in the 20s and probably the mid-20s, which is, tough to believe you'd say it, but Garrett Wilson's shown he can produce even with shaky quarterback play. Very good chance Justin Fields is the best quarterback Garrett Wilson's played with by the end of this year. And look, you can, to at least some extent, mitigate the lack of a supporting cast by throwing a heavy volume of targets at your number one receiver. Garrett Wilson's traditionally been a pretty heavily targeted receiver outside of last year with Rodgers. There were points last year with Rodgers where he wasn't all that heavily targeted. Although if you look at the end of the year, I mean, he still got a ton of targets. He's going to have to see a lot of them. And part of this is going to be on Garrett Wilson, because as the Jets receiver room's currently constructed, he's probably going to see a heaping portion of double teams. Now, Garrett Wilson's such a smooth route runner. He's so good at shaking defenders that he could probably beat double teams. Part of this is going to be on Tanner Engstrand, Jets' new offensive coordinator. He's got to find ways to free Garrett Wilson up, so that could mean more snaps in the slot. It's tougher to cover a guy in the slot because you got the entire middle of the field to work with. When you're on the outside, you can really only go north and south, or you can break in. There's really only 3 directions you can go. When you're in the slot, you're in the middle of the field. You can go north, south, east, or west. So you don't have the sideline defending you. You become a much tougher guy to cover. And then, you could get really creative how many times you want to line somebody up in the backfield, maybe draw a linebacker on them. There's going to be a lot on the bottom line. There's going to be a lot on Tanner Engstrand to free up Garrett Wilson. And there has to be, because if you look behind Wilson, there's just not a lot there. I mean, Lazard's your number 2 receiver right now, probably. And we've seen how that story goes. We saw this too. Remember 2 years ago when people were saying Lazard would be a good number 2 receiver? Didn't work out that way. Not quite. Lazard, if he's your number 3 receiver and he plays the way he did in Green Bay, is fine. I don't think he's better than a lot of number 3 receivers. I don't think he's worse than a lot of number 3 receivers. I think he's just kind of there. I think he's a guy who you can live with as your number 3 receiver. And after that, I think, unfortunately, there's a lack of overall upside. I mean, the Jets have signed a couple veteran guys this offseason. I mean, one of them's Tyler Johnson, who, he somewhat intrigued me a couple of years ago when he came out of Minnesota as a draft prospect. He was a day 3 pick, but he really hasn't done a whole lot in the NFL. And I mean, he's not that young. I think like when we're talking about somebody Tyler Johnson's age, Tyler Johnson is going to be 27 at the start of the season, and he really has done nothing in the league. I don't think he's anything more than like a fourth or fifth receiver, a depth guy. Josh Reynolds, Jets recently signed him. Well, I mean, Reynolds has had some okay seasons. Like Lazard, Reynolds has had some okay seasons, but he had 13 catches last year and about to turn 30. Back when the Jets signed Josh Reynolds, I mentioned that, it was a move that had logic, but the logic was less about his ability to produce and more about his knowledge of the scheme. Where I really am a believer that if you bring in a player who like has an intricate understanding of a system, they can be beneficial. They can kind of become an extension of the coaching staff. And I think especially the first year of a system, that has value because the incumbent players, the guys who were already on the Jets, they're essentially starting from scratch. They have to learn a new system, and having a teammate who really understands the nuances of the system can be a benefit. He can kind of like help point things out to his teammates and help make the installation process go a little bit easier. So that's what Josh Reynolds could do. Can he do more than that? I mean, I don't think he can. And, there's really only, the thing is like Garrett Wilson's the only guy on this team who's even had an 800-yard season. So, Jets are really kind of up against it. The wide receiver position is currently constructed. Then you've got Xavier Gipson, who has, give credit to Xavier Gipson for catching the old coaching staff's eye enough to earn a roster spot as a non-drafted free agent, and give him credit for whatever he showed them in practice, because he certainly didn't show it on the field to earn a decent amount of playing time. But I've seen Xavier. I always look at players' trajectories. Is a guy like on the upswing, and between year 1 and year 2, I don't really know what Xavier Gipson improved on. I mean, I don't think that he gives you a whole lot. And then Malachi Corley, who is just a total project, who gave you a 0 last year. And who, if the Jets did not have 3 running backs already that they felt good about, I would say move Corley to running back, because he's a guy who's shown his biggest skill is what he can do with the ball in his hands, not running routes. But I think anything from Corley is kind of a bonus at this point. I mean, this was this was a move Joe Douglas made because Joe Douglas thought he saw something that nobody else did. And I think, a year in, you don't really know what you're going to get out of Corley. But when you have a guy like that, you don't really know what you're going to get out of them. Most of the time, you don't get a whole lot. So the bottom line here is that this move doesn't change a whole lot. I mean, it gives you an extra chance. Lazard might be slightly more likely to be able to be a functional role player than the other guys the Jets would bring in, but there's not a lot at the receiver position. And that means they've got to do some work here. And had you on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about some of the work that they can do. And it primarily is going to be about a receiver that we talked about a little bit earlier, Tet McMillan. Jets could pick him at 7. He could help fix this wide receiver room, but easier said than done. Why is that? Well, we'll go into that as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Friday. Allen Lazard remains a member of the New York Jets in 2025. I got to say, I did not see that coming. Despite all the talk, and the Jets were pretty open about trying to rework Lazard's contract and get him back on a pay cut. I really did not believe it, but apparently Lazard is back, and amazingly, I actually kind of maybe sort of see the logic behind it. But if we're going to be honest, what we just discussed in the last segment, this does not fix the Jets' problems at wide receiver right now. Now, the Jets really have one thing going for them at the wide receiver position, and that's they have a legitimate number 1 receiver in Garrett Wilson. And that's a good starting point. And, if you go through the history of the Locked On Jets podcast, we started back in 2016. We haven't really had that through much of the history of this podcast. Until the Jets got Garrett Wilson, they did not have a number 1 receiver. In fact, Garrett Wilson is the first legitimate number 1 receiver the Jets have had since Brandon Marshall. And Brandon Marshall was really only a legitimate number 1 receiver for a single year in 2015. 2016, his game kind of fell off and he declined pretty rapidly. So Jets at least have a good starting point. They have somebody they can really funnel targets through. And as we talked about in the last segment, if the offensive coordinator Tanner Engstrand does his job effectively, Jets will be able to get Garrett into good situations and lean on him heavily. But you don't want to be in a position where you only really have one effective wide receiver because it puts a lot on Garrett. He's gonna have to beat double teams a lot, which he's capable of doing. But you don't want to ask him to do it on every single play. But you also want to give him an opportunity to take plays off. You want to, first of all, give, if he needs a breather, give it to him. But even when he's on the field, you don't want to force him to be the number one option every single time because, first of all, it makes your offense predictable. But second of all, you want somebody who's going to be able to beat coverages, somebody who's going to be able to be the primary target at least a handful of times. There are numbers suggest that, pretty much on 2/3 of passing attempts, the guy who's called as the number one receiver, the guy who's like the primary target, ends up getting the ball thrown to him. And it's a lot to ask Garrett Wilson to be that guy. When the Jets had Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams, I don't know how well it actually worked this way, but it was nice to have two guys who could actually get open. We could go through the ways the Adams trade did not work for the Jets, chapter and verse, and there were a lot of ways where the trade made no sense, but for at least 12 games or so last year, the Jets did have two guys who could beat coverage and get open, which was a positive, if nothing else. So how did the Jets do this? Well, you could look at the trade market. Sometimes there are sometimes there are veterans who are unhappy right now at this point of the year, and they end up demanding a trade. They end up getting traded late. I don't know of anybody who would fill that role right now who's available on the trade market, but you keep your eye on it. More likely, though, it would come through the NFL draft, and most likely, if you do it through the draft, you do it at 7 overall, and the guy who probably would be selected would be Tet McMillan out of Arizona. Now, on next week's episodes of Locked On Jets, we're really going to dive deep in the draft. We're going to talk about some of the prospects who really could interest the Jets with that 7th overall pick. McMillan is a prospect who's viable, first of all, because of his position, wide receiver, which is a critical position anyway. And I'm a believer there are certain spots in this league where it's impossible to have too much depth, where even if you've set, it's justifiable to draft somebody. I think quarterback is one of them. I think offensive line is one of them. I think edge rusher is one of them. I think cornerback is one of them. I think wide receiver is one of them. Jets are not set at wide receiver. Jets need help at wide receiver. And McMillan, because of his size, brings an element the Jets don't really have at the wide receiver position. And they don't really have good tight ends either. So there's no real big receiver in the Jets room who could be effective. As we talked about earlier, Lazard has a big frame, but he doesn't play like an effective big receiver. He essentially plays like a small receiver. So McMillan can bring that to the table. The challenge is that this is obviously not the only need the Jets have right now. And you could even look at the offensive side of the ball. Jets have a pretty gaping hole at the right tackle position. It's not going to be an easy one to fill in. There are other spots the Jets need to fill in and grab some help across the roster. Tight ends, one of them. I don't know that you're going to go tight end in the first round, but you just look at wide receiver, right tackle. You can only address a maximum of one of them in the first round. And you might not even address either of them because, say Mason Graham or Abdul Carter falls to you, you're probably going to take one of, the good chance you're going to take one of them, especially if I don't think Abdul Carter is going to fall, but if he did, he'd be like the run to the podium with the card pick. So it goes back to something we talked about earlier in the offseason. This is the challenge for the 2025 Jets, is that this was not a team that was ever going to be able to address every single one of its needs this offseason because the resources just weren't there. Wasn't enough cap space, weren't enough draft picks. And this goes into the phase the Jets are in right now. It's not a team. It's not a team that I'd say is tanking. We've talked a lot about this. There's this mindset out there. The Jets are going to be a 3-win team, a 4-win team this year. I don't think so. I think that unless they suffer a lot of injuries or unless something really unexpected happens, I think this is going to be a better team than people expect. But at the same time, this is not a team that's going to be fully built. So just going to have to prioritize. And, if we're talking about which positions do the Jets most need help at, I think wide receiver and tight end wide receiver and right tackle would be the two that would be the priorities in the draft. But it also comes down to the board. You can't get into the mindset we're drafting a specific player at this position because the Jets get to 7 and Tet McMillan is not the best player available to them, I don't think he's the guy who should be the pick. I think at 7, you really have to lean into the BPA mindset, unless it's a guy who just doesn't help your team at all. Unless it's a guy who, plays, unless he's a guy who's just like, he's not a fit for your team, then maybe you look in a different direction. But this speaks to the challenge that the Jets face right now. And the good news is that this is kind of like a one-year situation. Next year, the Jets should have more resources. Jets should be able to address a lot more of their needs. But it shows you the situation the Jets are in, where there are a lot of pretty big needs, including wide receiver, which is a critical need because Jets are trying to get more out of Justin Fields than his past teams did. It's going to be difficult to do that if you don't have better wide receiver play. But at the same time, there are plenty of obstacles. There are plenty of other spots the Jets need to address. So it just shows you the challenge the Jets face right now. We'll see how they deal with it. And next week, we're going to go into more detail on some of the draft prospects who could be available for the Jets. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoyed the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets, and we'll focus on the NFL draft.